All right, so thank you for coming to our webinar series. Today's presentation will be on sex trafficking, stigmas, and sex work. My name is Kenzie. I'm sure I know most of you on this chat, but if I don't, I work with the Family Support Center, and my role here is as a human trafficking case manager, and I serve both Chippewa and Eau Claire counties. I will also let my colleagues enter anybody else that is in the waiting room to get into this webinar. So what our office does is we serve, like I said, Chippewa and Eau Claire counties. In Chippewa County, we have our main office, also known as the Purple Building. So for those of you who are driving through Chippewa and you see the Purple Building, that's where we're located. We do have our sexual assault program as well as a domestic violence program in that location. We also have the River Source Family Center, which is for children birth to 5, and it serves more as a prevention, education, parent awareness type program. And we have some school-based satellite positions as well. And in Eau Claire County, we have an outreach office that Amanda and Annette are located in, and they serve Eau Claire County for sexual assault services. We provide individuals, families, and communities that are affected by intimate partner and domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and any other form of interpersonal violence. Some things that we do at Family Support Center is we have our 24/7 crisis and support line. We offer advocacy-based counseling services, and that is survivor driven. So whatever that survivor is in need of when it comes to those services, they are in the driver's seat of that. Medical information support and accompaniment. If folks are in need of a forensic exam, or if they want information on what that looks like, if they've been in a domestic situation and need some referrals to places, we can definitely be of assistance with that. Legal information support and accompaniment. We aren't lawyers, so we can't give legal advice, but we can help survivors navigate the legal, criminal, and judicial system as needed. Tools, resources, and referrals. So a lot of what we do is help survivors of violence build the tools they need to cope and heal from their experiences. Support and education groups. We have a variety of support groups and other types of groups that we host. We have those groups located in schools, in the jail, at some AODA treatment centers, and they are offered to folks of all ages. For youth, they do have a special parental permissions form that we need to have in order to do those services, but we are able to serve basically all populations in that type of setting. And then community outreach, education, and engagements, stuff like we're doing today, having webinars, presentations, outreach, all of those fun and exciting things to engage our community and also raise awareness and build that education. All of these services are offered in both Eau Claire and Chippewa counties, and all of our services are always free and confidential. So the webinar series, while you're here today, we are on the 4th part. So today is April 22nd, and we are going to talk about sex trafficking, stigmas, and sex work. Next week, same time, same place, we'll be talking about how cascading trauma and LGBTQ survivors are impacted by sexual violence, and that will be facilitated by Amanda, who is on the call today. Next, what to expect out of this webinar. So we are going to talk a lot about sex trafficking, sex work, stigmas, all of those types of things. By the end of this, I hope you'll be able to define what sex trafficking, sex work, and prostitution look like, and distinguish the differences between those. And then also be able to have a conversation about myths, facts, and misunderstandings that come with those topics. And we want to create conversation. So we hope that you leave this webinar today with the ability to have conversations on these topics and feel more confident in doing so. And also that you're able to bring awareness to the community and populations that you may serve in your work, home, or social life. So myth or fact, I'm going to ask that you either use the chat function, or if you want to turn your camera back on, unmute yourself, raise your hand, whatever that looks like. But I would really appreciate some engagement here. So I'm going to ask a series of questions over the next couple of slides on what you think is a myth or what you think is a fact. So is this a myth or a fact? The average age of entry into sex trafficking is 13 years old. Okay, so a lot of folks in the chat are saying fact. Let's see. This is actually a myth. So the misconception that the average age of entry into sex trafficking is 13 actually comes from reports, like anonymous reports made to the trafficking hotline. So it's just saying that the average age of reports that come in for youth that they think may have been victimized by trafficking rounds out to the age of 18 through that reporting center. So that's where that statistic comes from. And it's not accurate to the real representation of victims of sex trafficking and what that might look like. All right, any child under the age of 18 that is having transactional sex, whether that includes forced, coerced, or otherwise consensual methods, is automatically considered to be a victim of sex trafficking. False. Okay, anybody else in the chat or on your cameras think otherwise? Okay. So this is actually a fact. So in statutory definition, we know that youth who are having transactional sex or would otherwise be called engaging in prostitution, we know they can't actually consent to having sex under the age of 18 in most states. And that for youth who are having those transactional sex interactions, forced, fraud, and coercion do not need to be necessary. So any type of sexual intercourse or action that is happening with a youth and an adult is considered to be sex trafficking by definition. Victims of sex trafficking are sold for sex by a partner, family member, or employer. Do you think this is a myth or a fact? Yeah, and what Amanda put in the chat too for the last one, even if they don't have somebody who is trafficking them, they're still considered to be the victims of trafficking. And that creates another conversation that we might have later on about what are traffickers, what do they look like? Myth by anyone, okay. All right, so this one's actually a fact. So yes, kind of what you said in the chat, it can be by anyone, but what we see most often is that folks who are being trafficked are being done so by a partner, family member, or employer. An employer can represent their pimp, their person in charge of managing appointments, that type of things. Those can be considered employers. Some signs of human trafficking are wearing clothes for the wrong weather, being the only one of a specific race in a group of people, fear of authority, inability to live independently, and having an unusual or distinctly identifying tattoo, such as a barcode or a person's name. What are folks thinking? Fact, oh, there's probably a lot more. I'm going to guess myth. Okay, some mixed messages with this one. So this is a myth. Of course, some of these can be present, yes, if somebody is afraid of authority or they can't live independently. Those may also be things victims of trafficking experience, but they're not a sign of it necessarily. When we think of what the signs are of human trafficking, there's some videos out there called like spot the signs, things like that, that create these misconceptions of things that we need to look for to jump in and help and be able to kind of save people or remove them from the life, right? But what we do see more often is that folks who experience trafficking have very similar experiences of those who are in domestic violence relationships, who have experienced other forms of sexual assault or abuse. So while some of these may be at play here, other things that we see happening more often, or if they are not in control of necessarily their identifying information or don't have access to those, if they are all of a sudden really disengaging from friend groups or from family, have a new boyfriend, new girlfriend, new person in their life that they're spending a lot of time with, and then they're changing pretty dramatically from who they were prior to that. Again, they're not distinct signs saying this is what happens only when people experience trafficking, but those are ones that are more at play here with the conversations of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and human trafficking. They kind of all interchange and have very similar things that are more noticeable. And the last one for this page, sex workers and victims of trafficking are the same thing. Is that a myth or a fact? Myth, myth. All right. Yep, that one is a myth. Sex workers and victims of trafficking are different, and we will talk more about that in a little bit. All right, a couple more. Traffickers target victims that they don't know. Myth. Yes, myth. We see, I might have already said this in the last one, but most of the time we see that people they know and trust are the ones trafficking them. Of course, it does sometimes happen where traffickers are specifically looking for people they don't know, but they aren't just snatching somebody off the street, a complete stranger they've never interacted with, and swooping them off to sell them. What we see more so is there's grooming processes. They're looking for vulnerable people in vulnerable populations, runaway teens, adults struggling with substance abuse or homelessness, right? They're bringing them in, warming them up, making them feel loved and appreciated, to then turn around and manipulate them into selling their bodies for their profit. Movies, TV shows, and other forms of mainstream media portray human trafficking accurately and are great tools to use when learning about how to help survivors. Do we think this is a myth or a fact? Myth. Yep, definitely. The average experience of a trafficking survivor is not like what you see in Taken or what you've seen on SVU or even Grey's Anatomy. I think they just did an episode on trafficking survivors. And while some of them have pieces that are more accurate and more representational of the, don't want to say average either, but of more realistic experiences, they're still not fully there. They're not fully representing. Also because they have to be wrapped up in a quick episode, or they have to allow for that more intense piece of things. So victims of trafficking often have overlapping victimizations, such as domestic abuse, homelessness, or poverty. Do we think this one is a myth or a fact? Fact, okay. All right. True, yes. We see that a lot of the times there are those overlapping victimizations, and often too, they are a correlation or causation at times as well for why people might have been introduced or created the space where they were able to be victimized by trafficking. Trafficking involves traveling, transporting, or moving a person across the border. What do we think about this one? So we got a myth in the chat. Okay, yep, that's very true. That is human smuggling. They are very different. However, they are confused all of the time. And in, we will talk about this more a little later on too, but in policies, practices, historical contexts and where trafficking has been discussed or worked on, human smuggling is oftentimes interchangeably used in that language. And there's a very distinct difference in what those look like and how it impacts people. Effective intervention often takes time and patience and can be done appropriately when professionals like healthcare administrators and teachers develop trusting relationships where survivors feel safe to disclose. Is this a myth or a fact? Fact. Yeah, that one's pretty straightforward, right? Makes total sense that that would be factual. And lastly, trafficking primarily occurs in developing countries. Myth, okay, yeah. Yep, myth. Trafficking happens everywhere, and we see it a lot in countries like the United States as well, even more so than in some others, because it is, it's not a hidden crime, right? But it's one that's really, really difficult to pinpoint, to talk about, and work towards getting rid of. Okay, so the harms of misinformation, what that does for survivors. I included this photo here because when I looked up the definition of sex trafficking, the first thing that popped up was the action or practice of illegally transporting people from one country or area to another for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Some of this has truth, yes, for the purposes of sexual exploitation. That is the truthful piece in this. The part that is inaccurate in this definition is the illegally transporting people from one country or area to another. Well, yes, sometimes transportation across borders does happen in sex trafficking and other forms of trafficking as well. That's smuggling, right? That's taking somebody from one country or area and putting them somewhere else. It's different than trafficking. And by using those terms interchangeably, it creates a really difficult narrative to try to understand. So misinformation can lead to inaccurate representation. It's either too vague or too specific. If we have way too much information that is super vague, right? Like those signs we talked about, if they are unable to live on their own or dressed too cold for the weather. Well, what if they have a disability that we can't see that prevents them from being able to live independently? Or what if somebody is doesn't have money to be able to afford a winter jacket or other situations like that? That's not trafficking, right? Those are other things that are impacting that person's ability to do specific things. So by having too many vague pieces of information, we don't have an actual understanding of what this looks like and how to work towards helping survivors or preventing it in the long run. Dangerous situations for both victims, victim survivors and bystanders. So if you think someone is being trafficked and you don't know them, right? They're a stranger. You have seen all these videos on the signs or all the things that point towards what trafficking might look like, and you go to intervene and ask someone, are you being trafficked? Or you call the police, make a report, and this person's not, right? Maybe they're speaking a different language at a booth in the mall, and you ask them, are you safe? Are you okay? And they say yes, but you don't believe them, and you call law enforcement anyways. You've now created many things for this person to overcome. You have potential issues with their employer, right? You have assumed that because they're speaking a different language other than English, or because they might look different than you, that they don't belong or they're here for the wrong reasons, right? And you contacted law enforcement. If that person is not here legally, especially based off of the assumptions that were made because of their perceived race and language barriers, you might have exposed them to potential deportation, right? So you're creating those dangerous situations for both sides. And where you might be in danger by having tried to intervene is, what if that person actually is being trafficked and their traffickers they're sometimes really dangerous people. So by intervening and making yourself known and putting yourself in that position of vulnerability and danger, you're exposing yourself to potential harms. So really making sure that if you are wanting to intervene, you're doing so safely. And what that can look like is offering a friendly nod, smile, gesture to someone you think might be in danger, indicating that you're a safe person to come to in those ways. Creating really minor conversation, right? If they're wearing a cool shirt, they have a bag, or their hair is done really cool, going up to them and saying like, oh my gosh, your shirt is so cool, where did you get that? And having those types of conversations that seem really minor without putting yourself out there of saying, I think you're being trafficked, I think you're in danger, let me help you. And Amanda put in the chat, exposing trafficking survivors, victims to law enforcement intervention without their consent can also be dangerous to them. Yes, exactly. If you're involving law enforcement, and if they are, in fact, having experiences of sexual exploitation, law enforcement's not always safe for them because, one, prostitution's illegal. So you're potentially exposing them to being arrested, charged, and entered into the system in that way, which is going to remove resources from them in the future by having that on their record. Also, your law enforcement's not always safe, right? It's not always the best option when it comes to people in these types of experiences and what that looks like. Neglecting the experiences of a victim or survivor. So by contributing to these mainstream media perceptions of what trafficking looks like, you're eliminating that experience of what survivors actually go through, what happens beyond them being kidnapped and thrown in a van and driven to God knows where to be doing who knows what, right? And that's what the thought is of trafficking. What about all those other experiences that people have? Unnecessary intervention, like I was saying earlier, if you're going in and you're calling law enforcement because this person seemed out of place and had some of these signs that we are taught to look for when it comes to trafficking, you're creating more problems than you are solving them. Sometimes, right? Most of the time, likely. Inaccurate trainings, training hotel staff, for example, if you're teaching them to look for the signs of trafficking, and if their response to that is by no longer allowing that person to be there, to have that space that is safer, right? Being able to do that in a hotel where there's access to staff, other people, potentially law enforcement, if that is the option that they need. If that's no longer available to them, they're going to still have sex with these people, or they're going to still exchange sexual favors for monetary or other needs, and they're going to do so in the car, on the streets, in the bathroom somewhere, right? In way more dangerous places. So if your response is to react in that way following some of these misconceptions, that can cause further harm to survivors. The savior complex, contributing to the savior complex. We don't need to save these people who've had these experiences. We need to help them and help them heal. And by doing so is understanding what this really looks like. Lack of services or misappropriation of services. By continuing this narrative, you are eliminating actual resources for survivors and creating this barrier to connect to them, because they're going to think, if this is how everyone perceives trafficking, they're not going to be able to actually help me. And the confusion of sex work and trafficking. We'll talk more on this later, but sometimes folks really don't understand that there's a difference between the two and what that looks like. And people think that people who engage in sex work voluntarily are victimized by trafficking, when there's a distinction between what that looks like. So the use of problematic language, and some of the stuff we'll talk about a little later on, terms like modern day slavery or white slave is used. So when that is used to address victim survivors of trafficking, it's neglecting and contributing to racially charged narratives. So using these terms can imply that trafficking or exploiting white women specifically is worse than our nation's history of violence with Black slavery, and it downplays the experiences that Black slaves have had. And when talking to survivors and labeling them as a victim of trafficking, we are, rather than asking them how they want to be identified or using other language like someone who has been sexually exploited, can be problematic as well. So try changing out the narrative and how you talk about someone's experience. Instead of saying a human trafficking victim, you can say someone who's experienced sexual exploitation. This puts the victim survivor first and does not attach that distinct victimization to their experience of violence. In this presentation, I will be using language like human trafficking, sex trafficking, and sexual exploitation. And this is more so for when you're specifically talking to a person or a group of potential survivors, not attaching that label to their experience. So what sex trafficking? What are you? What is it? The Federal Department of Human Services defines human trafficking as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. Sex trafficking specifically is defined in the United States Trafficking Victim Protections Reauthorization Act as the recruitment, harboring, transferring, provision, or obtaining of an individual who under force, fraud, or coercion is induced to perform a commercial sexual act. That is a mouthful. And many victims of human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, do not use that language to define their experience. Many of them view themselves as victim survivors, not of trafficking, but rather of domestic violence, sexual assault, or sexual coercion, or don't see themselves as a victim at all. So who are these victims? Anyone can be a victim of trafficking. However, victims tend to be vulnerable teens, young adults, higher risk populations, undocumented individuals, those that are homeless, in foster care, or are marginalized in any other way. So youth sex trafficking specifically, children and teens who lack a supportive home environment are in the foster care system or have been involved in the child welfare system at some point, have ran away from home, identify as LGBTQ, are homeless, struggle with substance use or abuse. They are all at higher risk of levels of vulnerability in being victimized by trafficking. In 2015, it was found that about 50% of causes in micropolitan communities and about 82% of other communities had victim trafficking relationships that involved a child and their parent. And of those relationships, mothers were at a higher likelihood to traffic their children than their fathers, making up about 65% of identified parental traffickers. And that was shocking information for me to find out. When I initially thought of who would be doing that, my thoughts were the father, right? Or somebody identified as being the male provider in that household. So that was an interesting fact for myself to learn in this process too, which is another important reason why learning about trafficking is so important, because those myths and misconceptions alter the way that we view and help survivors. Rural communities are hotspots for trafficking children, as though local law enforcement in those areas don't always have the resources or education necessary to identify and combat the trafficking of minors. And a lot of energy and focus is put on combating commercial sexual exploitation of children. However, by focusing primarily on those non-familial traffickers, a large percentage of victims are neglected and continue to be victimized. So remember, it is not our job as advocates, family, friends, or otherwise to tell someone how to identify their victimization. And we believe as advocates, Family Support Center, and personally that everyone is the expert to their own identity, and that includes how they define their trauma experience. So the history of anti-human trafficking policies in the United States throughout the course of history. In 1904, the International Agreement for the Suppression of White Slave Traffic, and in 1910, the Convention on White Slave Traffic was had. This used the term trafficking for being specifically only white women and girls that were forcibly taken across borders for the purpose of exploitation. So in that same year, in 1910, the US Congress passed the White Slave Traffic Act, also known as the Mann Act, which attempted to maintain the morality and purity of the white woman by prohibiting them from crossing the borders for immoral purposes and criminalized interracial couples. Extremely problematic. In 1921, the International Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Women and Girls, it removed the terms white slave trade and acknowledged that race is not a mitigating factor in victimization. However, male adults were still excluded from this definition. And this didn't last, though, because in 1933, they changed the definition once again to say that trafficking was the transfer of women across nation-state borders. And it continued to promote the misidentification of human trafficking by confusing it with smuggling, and which involved those aspects of sexual exploitation. And when I say confusing, I mean that we have grown to understand that there are differences in what this looks like. And by doing research and acknowledging these changes, we are clarifying what this looks like and how that affects our ability to work towards removing these victimizations as a whole. So in 1949, the International Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Persons and the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others happened, which further moved away from the theory of the white slave and now used language which allowed for anyone of any gender, any age, race, to be identified as a victim of trafficking. The focus remained on sexual exploitation and forced prostitution, however. In the 1979 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, it further reaffirmed the linkage between trafficking in women and forced prostitution. In 2000, the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention against Transactional Organized Crime. That is I think probably the longest protocol ever written in history. Also known as the Palermo Protocol, which is so much simpler, which redefined trafficking as follows. Trafficking in persons shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat, use of force, or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, deception, the abuse of power, or of the position of vulnerability, for the giving or receiving of payment or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. So much unnecessary material in that definition. It's long, it's confusing, it's hard to read. So it made it difficult to really identify what trafficking is. So also in 2000, the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act was born. It was signed into law on October 28th of 2000. And was known as the cornerstone of federal human trafficking legislation in the United States and was passed in Congress almost unanimously. I think when I was looking at this law, there was like one person in opposition of it on both political sides. And then the Trafficking Victims Protections Reauthorization Act of 2003, 2005, 08, 13, and 19. This, along with the TVPA, was developed to combat human trafficking on both the domestic and global levels. So expanding that definition underneath the Palermo Act, it defined human trafficking as the illicit enslavement of people used for commercial sex or other labor services by force, fraud, or coercion. Much simpler, much more to the point, allows for a much easier understanding of what this looks like. And it would clarify the differences between human trafficking and human smuggling, finally. So there was a distinct differentiation in what that looked like as part of this Reauthorization Act. So sex work, what is that? Sex workers are consenting adults who provide a service which is sexual in nature for the exchange of money or goods. It is important to differentiate between this exchange of a consensual, non-coercive sex and the exchange of money or goods as different than providing a service out of necessity for those same money or goods. Yes, some people enter sex work to be able to provide for their family, put food on the table, pay for their education, those types of things. But they're doing that knowingly and consenting to what they're doing. Whereas if somebody is homeless or hungry or really needs a shower, and this person says, yeah, I mean, you can have all those things as long as you have sex with me. And they're like, okay, sure, yeah, fine, that, whatever. I guess I'll do that. That's different, right? It's out of necessity. They need a place to sleep. They need a shower. They need food. It's like, okay, fine, I'll trade this for that. Whereas sex work is knowingly, consensually doing those things without that necessity piece attached, which is where it can get really tricky. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act defines commercial sex acts as any consensual act for which someone of value or something of value is given or received. And that does include housing, food, shower, water, all those things. This is where those lines can get really sticky. Sex work is criminalized and stigmatized and comes with sometimes very dangerous circumstances. Sex work in and of itself is not inherently harmful, assuming that they are using different means of protection when they are engaging in sexual acts. But due to criminalization and stigmas, sex work becomes circumstantially harmful. So because of these stigmas, these misconceptions and what it looks like and the harm that can come from those, it becomes dangerous. So isn't all sex work human trafficking? We kind of already talked about that. Sex work does not equal human trafficking. Victims of trafficking can be sex workers. However, both parties are consenting and there are no elements of force, fraud, or coercion, and all the participants are adults, is likely not human trafficking. So the profession of sex work, according to a study done in 2010, Dr. Justin LeMiller of Sex and Psychology surveyed about 200 women in a country where sex work is legal. And this is what he found as reasons to why folks started doing sex work. They liked it. It allowed them sexual exploitation and sexual freedom in being able to learn what they liked, didn't like. It was something they enjoyed doing. They couldn't find a different job, whether they didn't have a high school diploma, GED, any of those things. They were transgender, being discriminated because of race or otherwise. They couldn't find a job. So this was something that allowed them to make money, make ends meet. Financial needs, supporting their family, paying back debts, supporting their addiction, paying an education, or helping out a loved one or partner. It's also important to note that these statistics percentages don't equal 100% because they were given the option to respond to more than one thing. And lastly, they're forced into it. The information I found said that less than 2% of folks who started doing sex work did so because they were forced into it. So folks who identified themselves as being a sex worker, which I think speaks a lot to these misconceptions, right? If only less than 2% are saying I was forced into sex work, then we know that there's that difference. Yeah, and Amanda put in the chat, all reasons besides being forced into it, people take lots of different kinds of jobs, right? Not just sex work. There's cleaning, there's retail, there's hostessing, bartending, waitressing, right? All those things because they need a little extra money to pay their bills, feed their kids, all those things. They're doing it for those reasons, and that's not exploitation. That's not trafficking, right? Why is it because sex is attached to it that it is now all of a sudden considered a crime? Facts on sex work, that same survey. These were some of the averages that he found. 32 was the average age of surveyed women for when they entered sex work. So we saw that statistic earlier, that age of 13 was when, is what is assumed to be the age in which people who've been victimized by trafficking began their trafficking experience. When what we see here was actually the age of 32 for sex work, right? There is a distinction. The average age of women was 32 and 23 was the average age in which they began their profession of sex work, which makes a little bit more sense. They were a little younger, but there's a big difference, right? 10 years from 13 to 23. They worked approximately 4 days a week. And the number of weekly customers they saw ranged from about 1 to 60, 1 being the lowest, 60 being the highest, but the average amount of those 200 women surveyed said they saw about 13 to 14 people a week. Their weekly income converted to approximately $1,300. And remember, this survey was done 10, 12 years ago, something like that. So that's a lot of money. Not the same amount of money they could make bussing tables or, cleaning out the hotel rooms, anything like that. And about a quarter of all of the workers stated they had done street work. However, many stated that they worked out of a parlor, studio, or through some sort of escort service. Over half reported no longer wanting to engage in sex work. I think that's really important to note here. A lot of people enter sex work for reasons, and then they get not stuck, but it becomes really hard to leave, right? Because of the stigmas, because of the danger, because once your face has been made public in pornography, in your community, and anything like that, removing yourself from that space can be so hard because it's criminalized, because it's stigmatized. Prostitution versus sex work. The words you choose matter. Sex work is acknowledging that sex work is work. Sex work is also more than just selling sex for money. It includes erotic performances, teleservices, productions of consensual pornographic videos or photos, and the sale of sex or other sexual services. If you've gone to a strip club or anything like that, can be considered sex work. Prostitution is criminalizing, stigmatizing, and contributes to the exclusion of health, legal, and social services for folks who engage in that work. So criminalizing, decriminalizing, and legalizing, what are these? For sex workers who are in favor of maintaining the current status in the United States of, not even the United States, but it is a state-by-state basis for most states in the country. These were their reasons. They had a preference in avoiding governmental involvement and regulation in the sale of their own bodies. They had concerns about loss of independence, loss of their individualized safety screening. So even though there are a lot of unsafe contributions to sex work, because it is illegal, right? They have specific ways in which they are able to make sure that they feel safe in how they're doing it. There's mandatory health exams that they don't want to have to participate in, and they want to maintain the current supply and demand. Right now, because it's illegal, the supply and demand kind of balance each other out. In the research I was looking at for this specifically, which were asked to sex workers in Nevada, or I'm sorry, not Nevada, in San Francisco, they were asked these questions of what are you in favor of? Criminalizing, decriminalizing, or legalizing? And these were the responses from folks who were actively engaging in sex work. For those in favor of decriminalizing the process, their reasonings were to have police protection, having the police on their side. I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago for my human trafficking grant, and I'd asked the question to the law enforcement in the room of how, when you arrest somebody for prostitution and you're engaging in an arrest for selling sex, how do you determine whether or not someone is a victim or somebody is doing something illegal? Like, what are your standards for making that determination? And the officer responded, said, I tell my guys not to arrest people for prostitution. He said, I tell them not to do it because we don't know the answer to that question. And I think that kind of speaks a lot to this is right now, because it is criminalized, folks in the sex service industry don't have that trust or that faith in law enforcement to be on their side and help them if they were to be victimized. So by decriminalizing it, by no longer having it be illegal, the folks who responded in this way said one of those reasons was to have that police protection. Having the ability to build a stronger network or networking community for sex workers. I know right now there's probably like Reddit threads and Tumblr pages and this and that where people can go on and talk. I think there's been talk of different apps that have screening services for Johns or people that are buying sex, who to watch out for. But because it is illegal in most states, those aren't always available or they aren't always reliable. Having more freedom in choosing alternative forms of employment in the future. There isn't that piece attached to it of potential charges or stigmatization if it's decriminalized. And allowing for better communication with potential consumers through phone, text, email, whatever that looks like. Because right now, if there's a sting set up, or if there's something going on where there's fear in place of being able to have those conversations outside of in person because you're afraid of being arrested for prostitution, you're not having those conversations. So by decriminalizing it, it gives that opportunity to have more. Amanda put in the chat, can you speak to criminalizing sex work and, for example, crime victim compensation access? So if someone is sexually assaulted while engaging in sex work and they may be ineligible for CDC due to voluntarily participation in criminal activity. That's a great question. And I can't say I know exactly the answer to how that would look. Because what I think when I hear that is underage survivors who may have been drunk while they were assaulted, those types of comparisons, right? They were drinking under the age. That's voluntarily participating in a criminal activity, but they were still victimized. They were still assaulted. They still had that experience. So for criminalizing sex work, right, it creates an even bigger barrier in place, because if your job is having sex with people for money and you're assaulted during that, there is so much victim blaming and there is so much attached to that, that people don't come forward, people don't report, they don't look for that option in their healing process of what that might look like. So while I don't have a specific answer for how that necessarily impacts crime victim compensation, because of the criminalizing of sex work, a lot of resources aren't available to survivors. And the next one, legalize. So for the sex workers that were in favor of legalizing it, some of the reasons were freedom to advertise their services on whatever platform they wanted and however they wanted to do so. Again, that police protections piece, the development or enforcement of safer housing and locations for work, not having to use hotels, not having to use the back of somebody's car, not using bathrooms or streets, right? Being able to have a location for ensuring sanitary space, for ensuring proper protections, right? Maybe security cameras at the door, not in the room where any acts are happening or anything like that, right? But being able to have more control over what that looks like for them. Systems regulation, having STD screenings, pregnancy prevention, health insurance, and access to other resources, all of those things can become a thing for sex workers that don't exist now. And while there were some back and forth and different opinions among sex workers when it came to systems regulations, those that were in favor of it had these reasons, right? Wanted to be able to have access to the same resources as somebody that is doing any other form of work. The Nordic model. So this is a model used in some European countries. It began in Sweden. And basically what the Nordic model is intends to criminalize the purchasers of sex, not the sellers. So it uses the framework that views sex work as violence. One of the main goals of the Nordic model is to eradicate sex work through criminalization and fines for the purchasers of that sex. It also demonstrates that the Nordic model promotes sex work as being inherently harmful to both individuals and society. According to the Global Network of Sex Work Projects, their framework views all sex workers as victims lacking agency and sees sex work as something that is impossible to choose or consent to. This is problematic. I specifically chose the resource that came from a sex worker's perspective because they are the ones impacted by this model, by this framework of criminalizing the buyers. In some cases, yes, criminalizing buyers can be useful based off of this source and the perspective of sex workers represented in this source. It sounds great in theory, but in practice, it continues to contribute to the criminalization and stigmatization of sex work. While it's intended to focus blames on the sellers, or I'm sorry, on the purchasers versus the seller, it used the example of if men don't purchase it, prostitution will cease to exist. So it only creates more unsafe environments for sex workers. It originated in Sweden and it's been adopted by several countries since then. It uses language which insinuates the intention of the Nordic model is to combat violence against women. However, in practice, it seems to rather serve as an additional method in which the government attempts to control the actions of women in their bodies and does not actually eliminate the dangers of sex work. And it does consider sex work as an industry, therefore making sex workers in those areas victims of trafficking. So this creates additional risk for harm, migrant workers specifically, as their workplaces are more rapidly and more frequently raided, and they become larger targets for arrest, abuse, and deportation. Anti-violence and sexual exploitation, what does this look like? So similar to all other forms of sexual violence, right? There's all these experiences that survivors have and what they look like. And if we only focus on the popular perception of what sex trafficking is, we are eliminating the experience of all survivors. And by using an anti-violence framework to address human trafficking means that we are centering the voices of survivors. They are the experts of their own experience. By being non-judgmental and offering options, not everyone victimized while in the profession of sex work wants to leave that work or needs to be saved. They might just want help healing from their experience to continue to do what they love or continue to do what brings them the income that they want or provides for their family, right? They might not have some of those other options because of other stigmatized and criminalized parts of their life. So offering those non-judgmental resources and being a safe space that is known for doing that. And knowing resources that aren't going to re-victimize or re-stigmatize survivors' experiences, steering away from the law enforcement judicial side of things, because we know that that contributes to re-victimization, traumatization, all of those things. And then continued education on issues of sexual assault, exploitation, other forms of sexually motivated violence. In addition to that, they connect to sexism, homophobia and transphobia, racism, and other systematic issues which directly impact those vulnerable populations we talked about early on that are more likely to be victimized by trafficking. So the Family Support Center rejects the hierarchy of violence. Individuals do not need to specifically self-identify as victims of trafficking to be considered priority for services. Every person's experience matters. And part of this too is somebody doesn't need to self-identify as being a victim of trafficking to be able to work with the human trafficking advocate, right? We're looking at what are those risk factors? Those are kind of the biggest piece of it. Who are in those vulnerable populations? Who are more likely to have been exposed to elements of trafficking, or who might have been more likely to have had elements of trafficking that they might not know are parts of that? So we believe that human trafficking is a human rights issue, that all victim survivors are entitled to equal access to aid mechanisms, protections, justice, all of those things, and they should be afforded the opportunity to access them in the way that they choose, or at least in the way that everybody else has the opportunity to, right? We know that healthcare in this country is not all that accessible, affordable, or available to folks, but by completely disallowing it because of something that is criminalized when it's not necessarily needed to be, we're eliminating those options to folks. And again, human trafficking is driven by those capitalist societies, poverty, oppressive structures, health and opportunity disparities all stem from that. But what if my values don't agree with sex work? You don't have to hold the same moral value as those who practice sex work to not want violence to come to them. By acknowledging the inherent dangers or those dangers that come as a result of the stigmatization of sex work and the objectification, victimization, and discrimination they face, you can support them by having been affected by violence, even if you don't agree with the work they do. Through continued education and the debunking of myths surrounding sex work and trafficking, you can contribute to societal change while still not agreeing with that practice. Sex workers are not obligated to provide you comfort in what they choose to do in their profession. And if you do not agree with what sex workers do, you don't have to hire them. However, if a sex worker does come to you for help following a sexual assault, How that happened does not matter. What does matter is that they have the same access to resources, services, and options as any other survivor of sexual assault, because that is what they are. They are a survivor, somebody who has had an experience of assault or exploitation, and how that happened or why does not matter. So in conclusion, sex work does not equal trafficking. Stigmas are harmful to both survivors of sexual exploitation and sex workers who've experienced sexual violence. People who do sex work for a variety of reasons, and judgment and discrimination are completely unnecessary and inherently harmful. Survivors of trafficking may not identify as having been trafficked. Using language like sexual exploitation or having been in an unhealthy or dangerous situation can create a safer space for victims to come forward when accessing services. And lastly, criminalizing sex workers and buyers does not reduce human trafficking. It only makes it more unsafe for sex workers and makes combating and identifying trafficking more difficult overall. So now I open the floor for questions, commentary, anything like that. There's been some really great questions in the chat. This has been a lot of information. So if there are any of those that you've been holding on to and want to ask, now is the time to do so. You can turn your cameras back on if you want, unmute yourself, put that stuff in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with. Okay, doesn't seem like there are any questions. So here is my contact information. I have my email and my direct line and our office's direct line. And then of course our 24-hour crisis hotline in case there are ever survivors that need to get in touch with us. If you have more questions, comments, or anything like that, you can reach out to me personally. But thank you all so much for coming and participating. I really appreciate your time. Oh, there is something in the chat. What tips do you have if someone identifies as being trafficked but is not a citizen? It's a great question. I would say knowing what resources are safe for that person. If they are coming to you and they identify that I'm not a citizen and I'm terrified of being deported, maybe not offering some of those systems that could potentially harm them. If they are wanting to go those routes, really having that conversation of what that looks like for them and their safety. Talking about, okay, you want to report to law enforcement, I am here to support you in that, and I will walk beside you in that process every step of the way. But here are some things that you should know of for this process and how it might impact you and how it might impact your family or this or that, right? Same type of conversations we would have for anybody that is maybe not a citizen or has other reasons as to why reporting is dangerous. It doesn't have to be specific to trafficking.
Yeah, and I think this is a great opportunity for those of us on the call who are advocates to really seek out, maybe in advance, proactively, and do some co-advocacy with those individuals and organizations who are already really versed in providing services to undocumented individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All right, if there are no other questions, you can feel free to hop off. Or if you want to stick around and ask something more privately, we can stop screen sharing so that way your video or voice doesn't show up, or recording, sorry. So yeah, sounds great. Thank you everyone again for coming and for listening.